digloid.com. Let's look at exposed to the right on the Fujifilm GFX100S. If you don't know what that is, see my previous videos. But basically, you expose more to get a higher quality image when shooting RAW. So in this test, I've used a two-part target. But let's go over some of the issues that are really important with the GFX100S in particular before we get into details. First of all, I discovered that ISO 50 can only be used with a full mechanical shutter. That's pretty much a non-starter, but I'm going to show ISO 50 anyway because there are cases where you can use it. Second, you don't want something called natural live view enabled because it makes the RGB histogram wildly inaccurate and the blinking highlights don't work. Third, unlike Sony's cameras, it doesn't have a zebra display. So Fujifilm seemed to have done as much as they could to make it kind of a pain in the ass to do ETTR, but you can still do it without too much trouble. All right, so what are the requirements? What are we looking for when we use, say, ISO 50 versus ISO 100 or ETTR? First of all, as a hard requirement, if we give identical exposure, we want ISO 50 to match ISO 100, and that in fact holds for the GFX100, which we'll look at. Our camera JPEG's better at ISO 50 given ETTR overexposure, quote overexposure, yes. Are the histograms more consistent at ISO 50? No, unfortunately not. So let's start with the first one and the proof that is ISO 50 the same as ISO 100, and also are increased exposures without blowout, of course, do they match the metered exposure exactly? And the answer to both of those is yes. So in the image below, we've got 5 exposures. The metered exposure is +0, and then we get +1/3, 2/3, 3/3, 4/3, 5/3. As it turns out, the one that's 4/3 a stop brighter than metered is actually the optimal exposure. Let's take a look at how that looks. So here's our image. This is an actual picture of a picture plus a color card. These were sitting side by side. And as I mouse over these, let me get that thing loaded up there. This is our +0 here. The 0.04 means 0.4 seconds. So ISO 50 versus ISO 100. You can see I'm mousing back and forth over them. There is no difference between them. Each pair, that's true, no difference at all. So ISO 100 and ISO 50 at the same exposure produce exactly the same raw file, and there's no difference in the final image. Now, when you get to our optimal one out here at +4/3, 1.0 seconds, you can see they're still identical. No difference. +5/3, you can see the sky starts to change color just a hair. It's subtle, but it's there. So that's an overexposure. It's a little too much, but it's still pretty hard to tell from +4/3. So what have we found here? ISO 100 is the same as ISO 50 in terms of the image. No difference. Can't even see it. And all these overexposures this is our metered, our dark exposure at 0.4 seconds. What the camera wants to meter and shoot is no different when you shoot RAW as opposed to exposing at +1/3, +2/3, +3/3, +4/3, and 5/3 a little blown, but no difference at either ISO. And you gave it, and at 4/3 stop more exposure, there's actually 1.5x8 less noise. So if you're a landscape shooter or something like that, that's a big deal. All right, so when we look at RAW versus JPEG, if you're shooting this extra exposure, your JPEGs and therefore your images you're going to review in the camera are going to be too bright. So if we look at our +4/3 here on JPEG, this is the JPEG row right here. If we look at +4/3, you can see it's very bright. And that really sucks in the camera. You're trying to view the image, but you don't have much choice if you want to give it the proper exposure. That's what it should look like. You can see all the raw exposures look the same. But the JPEG, which is what the camera's going to show you, if you shoot RAW plus JPEG or the embedded JPEG, it's going to look blown out, and that's a real bummer. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like there's anything on the Fujifilm that's going to work around that. ISO 50 actually does give you a good image, and this is why I would prefer to set the camera to ISO 50. But for whatever reason, the Fujifilm firmware designers decided that you can't use ISO 50 unless you use a full mechanical shutter. I don't know of any technical reason for that, but they put that stipulation in, which kind of makes ISO 50 a bummer. So you're stuck with going ISO 100 and getting an image review that looks like this, or ISO 50 and mechanical shutter with a great looking image like that. I don't know of any camera on the market that's sucky, but Fujifilm managed to pull it off. All right, so when we actually look at these exposures, there's another way to look at them. What I've done here is I've laid up the RawDigger histograms, which show the actual content of the raw file here, and this is the RawDigger histogram. You can see the green channel is most exposed, and it's just touching the maximum value of 64,000. These are 16-bit files, so 64,000 is our max. And over on the right, I've shown ISO 50 and ISO 100. This is what the camera shows you in live view RGB histogram. You can press a button to see this. And you can see that at ISO 50, our maxed out exposure looks like it's got plenty of room to go, which is not true. And our ISO 100 exposure looks like things are spiking at the right, as if it were blown out, as well as seeing this blinking highlights problem. And yet, RawDigger proves right here, and also we saw the images up above, that this is in fact at 1.0 seconds or plus 4/3. That is the ideal exposure. But this histogram is too conservative and will mislead you into overexposing at ISO 50. And this histogram at ISO 100 makes you think it's blown out. So if we back off 1/3 of a stop to 1 stop over metered, we can see that the ISO 100 now no longer shows blowout, but it's given this red spike, which is, as you can see over here, is totally false. The red's nowhere near being blown out. It's got at least a stop to go. The green's got a little bit more to go, and a little bit more to go. The blue has got at least a stop to go, and yet the histogram shows it's spiking and maybe blown out. So the camera histogram basically sucks, and it's not a great tool. But the one thing you can look at is, at ISO 100 at least you get this blinking highlights business, and if you give up 1/3 of a stop, so you back off to this instead of this, that's fine. You're going to not get 1.5x less noise, you get 1.4x. It's still a big win. What I don't like is that this ISO 50 histogram, if I go all the way to plus 5/3, you can see it still has no blowout showing, and it still looks like I could give it more exposure. So I guess I deem ISO 50 pretty much unusable on the Fujifilm. I mean, I suppose you could see this grid here. You could say, well, if it's not past halfway here, let me go back to plus 4/3. If it's not past about halfway, then we're good. Something like that, maybe. I don't know. It's just a little too sketchy for my taste. All right, so moving right along, if we look at a pair of histograms here, what we've got is, this is on the left is the histogram in live view. If you program a button for histogram, you can pop this up, and it will show you a live RGB histogram. And on the right is the histogram once you've taken the picture. So what we can see here is that the live view histogram is actually pretty misleading. You can see how this looks like you got plenty of room to go. You know, there's gap on the right, gap on the blue, gap on the red, gap on the green, gap on the blue. When you actually take the picture, you can see this is way over to the right in all 3 cases. So at ISO 50, the live one is misleading and really no good. And then if we go to ISO 100, at the same optimal exposure, we determined that above, you can see that at ISO 100, the live view histogram shows a spike here and a spike here, and it's showing blinking. It's telling us this is overexposed and no good, when in fact that's the optimal exposure. So that kind of sucks. You might back off just a little, but look, no blinking highlights, but you still got this blue spike and this red spike claiming that you're blowing things out. So we want to be here, and then when you take the picture, the other problem is we get this really washed out, overly bright JPEG, which is what you see, which is what the camera is going to show you. So you're looking at this and saying, blinking highlights, histograms way to the right. I've just toasted this image. So this is not good. The tools are poor. I mean, if you shot it at ISO 50, this would show you something that looks reasonable, and you can see only there at plus 5/3 ISO 50 now looks all spiked, and it actually is blinking the highlights. So maybe you could use ISO 50, go for blinking highlights, and then back it off one. Although you can see there's just a little bit of stuff here. So maybe that's a solution. And you notice the quality of the JPEG at ISO 50. It's a very reasonable brightness. Both of them suck for very different reasons. So that means the Fujifilm sucks with its histograms, but what can you do? And these are just the histograms. Again, I'm going to show you just to make it simpler here. Here's +0, +1/3, +2/3, +3/3, +4/3. That's our optimal. Exposed to the right, you can see it's right up against the limit of 64,000. Actually, it's just shy of that. You can see max 65,155, and the max is actually 65,204. So +4/3 is our optimal ETTR exposure, and that's confirmed in the info windows. If you look at this is the +4/3 here, you can see there's no highlights showing as blown. We've got an overexposure of 0.0% and an underexposure of 0.0%. If we go to +5/3, you can see that it's marking the bright whites as now being at risk. And apparently they are, but when I processed those images, I saw no loss of detail. So you could have shot this and still be okay. And it does tell you there's 2.5% overexposed, but as it turns out, the actual final image comes out just fine. So if you made an error and landed a little too hot on this, you'd still be fine. But again, the +4/3, this one right here is our optimal. All right, so that's a look at what's in here. And so what do? There's no good solution here with the GFX100S. Its tools suck. I mean, all mirrorless cameras suck for ETTR in terms of what they show you, but the Sony is better. So it's got zebra stripes, and it's got histogram at ISO 50, which is a little better. But the main thing is that you got to use a mechanical shutter for ISO 50, and that's kind of a showstopper, especially if you're focus stacking or something like that, where it goes bang, 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 bang. Just unacceptable. So I think, for me at least, I'm probably stuck shooting at ISO 100 and paying close attention to the blinkies and dealing with these overexposed looking washed out JPEGs. And unfortunately, I don't see any way around that at this point in time. So this is what you'd be looking at here, +4/3, blinkies going on here, spikes on the right. And it's scary because you think maybe I blew this. So another thing you can do is back it off so you see no blinkies, shoot that, and then go a third of a stop further. But that's so close that it's probably not worth it. So maybe just go with this exposure, which is you lose out by a third of a stop, but you got a safety margin and you can feel less concerned about it. But you've still got this overly bright JPEG. So no good solutions for Fujifilm, but you can do ETTR with these limitations.